It all began on what was supposed to be a peaceful and joyful day, my birthday. As the sheriff of our small town, I decided to celebrate it with a simple backyard barbecue. A few close friends, meat sizzling on the grill, chilled drinks in hand, and soft guitar music playing in the background. There was no loud music, no wild behavior, just laughter and a quiet vibe among good company. But for some people, happiness itself seems to be offensive, and unfortunately, I lived near one such person, a woman who treated the neighborhood rules as sacred scripture and had an allergic reaction to anyone else enjoying life. The moment the smoky scent of pecanha floated through the air, I felt that cold tingle in the back of my neck, that warning sign that trouble was brewing. It didn't take long. A sharp knock landed on my door, the kind filled with indignation, and when I opened it, there she stood, arms crossed, nose upturned, wearing that face full of misplaced superiority. "It's too noisy," she snapped, acting like she had legal authority over my house. But I was in a good mood. It was my birthday after all, so I counted to 3, forced a polite smile, and replied calmly, "Well, it's a special occasion today, my birthday, you know." I half expected at least a mumbled happy birthday, but instead she looked at me like I'd just committed a crime. "It doesn't matter. The neighborhood rules are clear about disturbances. I could call the police," she threatened. Now that's when my patience really began to melt. First of all, I am the police. Second, there was no disturbance, just a few people enjoying a quiet afternoon. And third, who calls the police over laughter and guitar strumming? I wasn't about to let her ruin my day, so I nodded dismissively and closed the door with practiced calm. The party resumed, and for a while I forgot all about her. That peace, however, didn't last long. About an hour later, something odd caught my attention across the street. A black car pulled up, and 2 men stepped out wearing what looked like cheap knockoff police uniforms. Badges hung from their chests, but something was off. They looked like they ordered their gear from a questionable website that also sells Halloween costumes. Then I saw her, standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and a satisfied look on her face, like she'd summoned Gotham's finest to shut down a criminal empire. That's when I realized she had actually hired fake cops. 2 men who thought they could bluff their way through a neighborhood on a fake authority trip, right into the backyard of the town sheriff. The tall one pointed at me and said, "Sir, we've received a report of a disturbance. You need to shut this event down immediately." And at that moment, I knew I'd just been handed the best birthday gift of all. I crossed my arms and played dumb, as if I hadn't just been presented with the most ridiculous scene of the year. "Oh, really? That's interesting. And who exactly called you?" I asked, feigning curiosity. The shorter guy, who looked like he'd been dragged into this scheme with the promise of easy money, quickly replied, "We can't reveal the identity of the complainant, sir." Sure, because clearly they were running a very professional operation. I let out a long, exaggerated sigh, and then let the grin crawl into my voice. "Well, I'm glad you're here because I happen to be the sheriff of this town." The moment those words left my mouth, everything changed. The 2 men froze, their faux confidence evaporating instantly. The party went dead silent as my friends leaned in, trying to hold back their laughter. Even the grill seemed to pause its sizzle in anticipation of what was coming next. I took a step forward, calm and collected, like a man who already knew exactly how this comedy of errors would end. "So you said you received a report of a disturbance?" I asked again, my voice loaded with ironic amusement. The tall one cleared his throat, attempting to salvage some authority. "Yes, sir, the neighborhood been complaining about noise. We're just doing our duty." I nodded, humoring him. "Of course, I completely understand. Just one thing, where exactly do you work?" He blinked, hesitating. The shorter guy opened his mouth, then thought better of it. Finally, the tall man said the most vague thing possible. "We're contract agents for a special department." Oh, the silence that followed that was beautiful. Even the wind stopped moving. I raised an eyebrow. "Special department?" I repeated, just to let the absurdity echo a little longer. "That's right," he confirmed, clearly digging himself deeper into the grave. I could have ended it right there, called for backup, and had them both arrested on the spot. But where's the fun in that? I wanted to let this play out a little more. "Interesting," I said, "because I work very closely with every department in this city, and I've never heard of a special department that sends out unknown agents to respond to birthday party complaints." That's when the shorter guy finally realized the size of the hole they were standing in. He nudged his buddy, not so subtly signaling that it was time to leave, but it was far too late. "Look," I said, resting my hands on my hips. "Why don't we do this? Show me your badges, your documentation, something to prove you're here legally. Then we can talk about this complaint." Dead silence. The tall one started glancing around, searching for an escape. The short one practically tried to disappear into his own shoes. Across the street, the mastermind of this disaster, my lovely neighbor, started retreating slowly, hopping to vanish unnoticed. At that point, I could have wrapped it all up, made the call, and let justice do its job. But honestly, I was having too much fun. I wanted to see just how deep they'd dig themselves. "You know what's funny?" I said, letting my voice drop just a bit, drawing their full attention. "This neighborhood actually does have a real nuisance problem." That piqued their interest. The tall one straightened his posture like a dog perking up to a whistle, thinking I was about to confess or give them a reason to justify their presence. "Exactly. That's why we were called in," he replied quickly, eager to regain control. I nodded thoughtfully, playing along. Right. Only problem is the disturbance isn't coming from my house." I turned slightly, pointing a slow, steady finger toward the woman across the street. "It's coming from that lady over there, who thought it was a good idea to hire 2 fake cops to harass the sheriff of the town." The shorter guy made a sound that was part gasp, part choke. The tall one opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to come up with a single word. And the neighbor, her smug posture collapsed as she took 2 more awkward steps back, clearly torn between bolting for the woods or pretending she was just a confused bystander. I crossed my arms, letting the silence do the work. "So let me guess," I said, now turning back to the pair. "You have no legal authorization, no real badges, no official affiliation with any security force, right?" The shorter guy's eyes widened in panic, like he'd just realized how illegal things had gotten. The tall one looked everywhere but at me. The sky, the grass, the gravel. And then, as if someone hit a switch, both men turned and started walking quickly toward their car. I laughed out loud. "Where do you 2 think you're going?" They didn't answer. They just walked faster, desperation leaking out of every step. "You know that running from a real cop just makes this whole thing worse, right?" And they ran. But here's the thing, they weren't fast enough, because just as they reached their car, the sweet sound of a real police siren echoed down the block. A squad car rounded the corner, lights flashing, and guess who was driving? My work partner, already patrolling nearby and quick to answer my call. The moment the fake cops saw him, they froze mid-step. The tall one tried to stammer out an excuse, but before he could get a full sentence out, the booming voice of a real officer rang out. "Hands where I can see them, now." Seconds later, both of them were handcuffed and leaning against the hood of their car, reality crashing down hard. And now, with them handled, it was time to deal with the woman who started it all. I turned slowly toward her house, just in time to see her trying to slink away unnoticed. "Hey, neighbor," I called out, loud enough for everyone watching to hear. She paused at her door but didn't turn around. "We still need to talk about your brilliant idea of hiring backyard security guards to try and run my house." She stood frozen in the doorway, the look on her face shifting from superiority to sheer panic. You could almost see the battle in her mind, whether to run inside and pretend none of this happened or try to salvage what was left of her reputation. But it was far too late for either. She made her move and lost, and now everyone on the block was watching. I crossed the street at a relaxed pace, like I was strolling over for a neighborly chat. "Let's talk," I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. She glanced nervously at the 2 handcuffed men by the car, then back at me. I don't even know who those guys are," she muttered. I laughed. "Oh, really? Because I remember very clearly seeing you watching proudly while they tried to shut down my birthday party. You even looked pleased when they tried to intimidate me." She huffed but didn't back down. "I just called private security. The party was out of control." I raised an eyebrow. "Out of control? You mean some people laughing and a guitar playing in the background?" She pressed her lips together tightly, realizing how foolish that sounded. "The neighborhood rules," she began, but I cut her off. "Neighborhood rules don't include calling in 2 guys dressed as fake cops to harass the town sheriff." She had no response. "But do you know what city laws say?" I asked calmly. She didn't answer, so I kept going. "They say that impersonating law enforcement and hiring unlicensed security for harassment purposes is a crime." Her face paled instantly. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she searched for a way out of the mess she'd created. And then, as if fate had impeccable timing, one of the real officers stepped out of the patrol car holding a radio. "Sheriff," he called, "we just ran these two through the system. Turns out they already have records, fraud, extortion. This isn't the first time they've posed as law enforcement." I turned back to her, feigning surprise. Wow, who would have guessed? She looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. "I didn't know," she blurted, finally playing the oldest card in the book. "I was tricked. I thought they were legitimate." "Oh, sure," I said, arms folded. "So the woman who's obsessed with neighborhood rules, who monitors everyone's trash bins and grass height, just randomly hired two strangers off the internet without checking anything." She tried to respond, but the words died in her throat. Her usual self-righteous fire was gone, replaced by a stammering panic. I turned to the officers, who were now reviewing fake badges and flimsy paperwork. One of them laughed. "This card looks like it was printed at a Halloween store." I nodded. "Yup, probably right next to the vampire hunter licenses." Meanwhile, she stood there silent, staring down the barrel of a mistake that had spiraled wildly out of control. The real comedy of the situation was that while the two fake cops were being cuffed and processed, the woman who orchestrated the whole circus was still standing there like a statue, unsure whether to run, cry, or try one last desperate lie. I walked up a little closer, still calm, still polite. "So you were tricked, huh? You thought these guys were a serious company?" She nodded quickly, but her eyes darted around like she was searching for an escape route. "Interesting," I said, tilting my head. "Because you've spent the last few years glued to everyone's lawn, taking notes on car parking angles and mailbox paint. You're telling me that you suddenly forgot how to do research." Her mouth opened again, but nothing came out. She had no argument left that could withstand the facts, and the truth was written all over her face. Then came the knockout punch. One of the officers walked over, holding something in his hand. "Sheriff," he said, "we've got more. Her phone has been seized and contains payment receipts, messages, the works. These two weren't just hired, they were instructed, and she knew the service wasn't legal." I turned back to her with an exaggerated gasp. "You don't say." "So you knew it was illegal and hired them anyway?" She looked like she was about to faint, her face now completely drained of color. "I just wanted peace in the neighborhood," she whispered. "Sure," I said, smiling. "And what better way to spread peace than to hire criminals to impersonate police and try to shut down a sheriff's birthday party?" One of the officers beside me stifled a laugh, but the woman clearly wasn't amused. She began shaking slightly, whether from rage or fear I couldn't tell. "This is absurd," she said, trying to regain some ground. "I'm a respectable citizen." I raised an eyebrow. "Respectable. I think the definition of that word doesn't include hearing known fraudsters to harass your neighbors." Her panic finally boiled over. "This is abuse. You're humiliating me in front of everyone," she yelled. I remained perfectly still. "You're not being humiliated," I said calmly. "You're being investigated. There's a difference, and you should have thought about that before you tried to play dictator." The officer next to me stepped in. "Sheriff, based on what we've heard and what the suspects confessed, we've got enough for an indictment: impersonation, harassment, attempted coercion." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she just stared blankly, like it was all finally sinking in. "No, wait, this is a misunderstanding," she pleaded, but the mask had already slipped. Everyone could see the truth now. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't trying to help the neighborhood. She'd been caught red-handed, and all she had left were excuses and silence. As she stood there, struggling to find words that might save her from the storm she'd created, I tilted my head slightly and delivered one more question that pulled the last thread. "So, can we take a look at your phone?" Her eyes darted toward the device like it had suddenly turned radioactive. What?" she stammered. "Your phone," I repeated, keeping my tone casual. "If everything you did was legit, then I'm sure you don't mind us reviewing the conversations, payment confirmations, maybe even the ad where you found these security professionals." The silence that followed was deafening. You could almost hear her pride snapping under the pressure. And then, as if on cue, one of the officers called out from near the patrol car. "Sheriff, bad news for her. Those two guys admitted everything. Said she knew exactly what kind of operation it was." My smile widened. "You don't say," I replied, voice dripping with theatrical shock. The woman's jaw moved, but no words came out. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. She knew it was over. There was no spinning the story, no half-baked defense to toss out. Her only move now was to surrender to the truth, or at least shut up before making things worse. I crossed my arms and summarized the scene for her. "So just to make sure we're all clear, You hired fake officers, knew they weren't legitimate, used them to target a neighbor you've been harassing for years, and now you want us to believe it was all just a big misunderstanding." She was trembling now, clearly unable to take control of the narrative, something she was so used to doing in this neighborhood. I just wanted peace," she muttered one last time, her voice thin and weak. "Oh, I believe you," I said with a grin, "but calling in fake cops to silence your sheriff neighbor, that's certainly creative." The lead officer turned to me. "What do you want us to do, Sheriff?" he asked. The moment had come, and all eyes in the neighborhood were now glued to this final decision. She wasn't speaking anymore, just staring at the ground, probably hoping it would open and swallow her whole. "But I didn't give her that mercy. Take her away," I said simply. The crowd, which had gathered in silence, held their breath as the officers stepped forward. And there it was, the queen of neighborhood regulations, the self-appointed warden of lawn lengths and mailbox colors, being led away in handcuffs while every resident watched. The same woman who spent her days patrolling sidewalks and sending threatening letters now found herself being escorted into the back of a police cruiser, wrists bound, dignity shattered. "This will have consequences," she shrieked as the car door slammed shut. "You'll regret this. I have contacts. I have rights." But the only reply she got was the cold thud of the cruiser closing and the hum of a neighborhood finally breathing in sweet relief. When the police cruiser finally pulled away, the silence it left behind was almost surreal. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with condescending notes and constant complaints was gone, and for the first time in years, the street felt peaceful. I turned back to my guests, ready to wrap up what remained of my birthday barbecue, but something unexpected happened. Slowly, one by one, my neighbors began to approach. At first, they came cautiously, murmuring quietly among themselves, unsure if they should say anything. But then someone broke the ice with a laugh. "Well, Sheriff, that was one hell of a party." Another neighbor who I'd only seen in passing raised a bottle. "To the sheriff," he shouted. "Finally, that woman got what she deserved." And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. Laughter erupted, toasts were made, and people started celebrating, not just my birthday, but what felt like the end of a long reign of terror. Even the more timid neighbors, the ones who always looked uncomfortable around her house, smiled for the first time in years. It was like the entire block had just been freed from an invisible leash. The barbecue reignited into an impromptu block party, a spontaneous festival marking the fall of a self-imposed tyrant. They shared stories. One man said she'd once complained because his dog barked twice in a row. Another recalled getting fined for having a holiday wreath up one day too long. A woman laughed as she recounted being warned for planting daisies that weren't community standard. We all realized we had been living under her scrutiny without even realizing just how much she had made herself the judge and jury of our private lives. And now, as the smoke from the grill danced in the air and music gently returned, it was like the whole street had been reset. People were smiling, chatting, making connections that had long been suppressed by the uncomfortable tension she always brought with her watchful presence. As for me, I stood back for a moment and just watched. I'd only wanted a quiet birthday, a few laughs, and some good food. But this was something else. It felt like justice, but it also felt like a turning point. I knew then that this neighborhood would never go back to the way it was. People had seen her for what she really was, and no amount of fake apologies or neighborhood newsletters would ever restore the power she once held. She tried to return, of course, but not right away. First came the legal consequences, and then the social ones. Because while the courts would handle the impersonation charges and fines, the neighbors had already delivered their own verdict. After that unforgettable day, the woman who once treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom faced the harsh reality of consequences. The legal case moved quickly, thanks to the mountain of evidence. The fake cops she'd hired wasted no time turning on her, handing over every detail: messages, payment receipts, even voice recordings of her instructions. Her seized phone only confirmed what we already knew. She had knowingly hired frauds to pose as law enforcement and target me, the town sheriff, out of nothing but petty control. She was charged with impersonation, harassment, and attempted coercion. The judge didn't hold back. Alongside a hefty fine, she was ordered to pay damages and was slapped with a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. But her legal punishment wasn't even the worst of it. The real blow came when she tried to carry on like nothing had happened. She didn't move out immediately, no. For a few months she attempted to walk the neighborhood as she once did, head high, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy. But the neighborhood had changed. People didn't look her in the eye. Conversations would pause when she passed. No one waved back. It was a quiet, collective decision. She would no longer be welcomed here. Her attempts at small talk were ignored. Her fake smiles went unreturned. She had lost not just respect but relevance. Eventually, the pressure of silent rejection was too much. One morning, without notice or farewell, she moved out. No trucks, no goodbye party, no final bulletin slipped under our doors. Just gone. She vanished as discreetly as someone like her could, leaving behind the house that had once been her fortress of complaints and condescension. And the change afterward, it was remarkable. The neighborhood blossomed into something it hadn't been in years, a place of peace, laughter, and mutual respect. There were still rules, of course, but they were handled like they should have been all along, with communication and understanding, not threats and theatrics. I still get chuckles and pats on the back whenever neighbors bring up the birthday showdown, and it's become a bit of a legend in the area. Remember when Karen tried to have the sheriff arrested? They'd laugh, and I'd nod with a grin. Because honestly, I just wanted a barbecue. But what I got was the most satisfying birthday present ever, the fall of a paper tyrant, brought down not by force, but by her own arrogance and a well-timed twist of fate. The message was clear and permanent. No matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the law and the people will always be there to remind them where the line is drawn.